Our lecture today, we're looking at wrapping up the course leading the last decades of the 17th century with reign of Charles II of England, James II of England, the Glorious Revolution, William and Mary, and looking to the influences of Louis XIV of France, and the growth of Russia, Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and then finally the scientific revolution. But begin with witchcraft. The Renaissance and the period afterwards was a time of great scientific expansion, scientific achievement. But this was a world that much of it still lived in darkness, of ignorance and fear. So old superstitions died away, did not die quickly. People still believe that magic and dark magic permeated the world. That witches and demons, specters would haunt the nights, torment their days, torment their spirits. And in this period, this intense warfare between Catholics and Protestants, these old fears came to the surface that the force had been seen for centuries. Now, the creation of the Inquisition, that is, the traveling church court in the 13th century, people have been accused of a variety of witchcraft practices. Now, the Roman Catholic Church's position had been one to push for complete uniformity in doctrine and thought and belief among the people of Europe. There were some old holdover religions from the period before Christianity, nature religions like Wicca, the Druids, and so forth, but very small numbers. And as the centuries progressed, there were even fewer and fewer. By the time of the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, these were more than just old religions. Very few adherents left. But at this time period, they would not dare speak of any open allegiance to a thing that was not belonging to the Christian Church. Well, many people believe that witches did exist, that were agents of evil, and that had to be eradicated. Some pointed to a verse in the Bible that said, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." They took it literally. Executions of suspected witches were quite common, especially through the direction of the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition increases in Spain even more so. But what usually happened, though, is in a witchcraft trial case, you were essentially guilty by accusation. You would not have any opportunity to prove you were innocent. You would not have a lawyer or a jury. It would basically be church officials who would accuse you, and you would be there to plead your case. And the only way you could ever is even open admission of guilt wouldn't even deny you the death penalty. Overwhelming evidence against your guilt very rarely would sway these officials. And the church believed the only way to save you and save your soul would be execution. In almost every case, it'd be being burned at the stake. If your soul was saved, if you were burned at the stake as being accused of being a witch. There was an exception, though. England would hang witches. This was actually the only exception. Well, in the 1500s and 1600s, there's a great increase in trials and executions. Estimated perhaps as many as 100,000 prosecuted on charges of witchcraft. Usually be the large cities first, when this outbreak would spread. The vague accusations would be gathering steam, like a snowball effect. They would just gather more and more and more. Hysteria would spread. The number of people caught up in the outright accusations being accused themselves multiplied. before they knew it, perhaps hundreds of innocent people would be executed. I think the flimsiest of evidence or non-evidence at all. As you started in the large cities and spreading out to the smaller communities, the manors and the countryside and so forth, finally the fear would burn itself out. Suddenly they'd wake up and realize no one had ever been a witch at all. But the damage was done, could not be undone. Suspects are tortured into confession by a variety of means, all sanctioned by the church. Most would confess to Satanism using spells or incantations. What we usually see when we study these from an objective point of view is there's a great deal of religious uncertainty at the time these suspected outbreaks occur. Usually these would be areas that Protestants had just won from Catholics, areas like the 30 Years' War in Germany, or the various Lutheran wars in the 16th century and elsewhere. Essentially, one faction of Christianity against another. One faction usually just wanted control of an area, fearful that their gains were about to be undermined at any moment. They're scared, they're uncertain. That's why in Germany you see so many accusations of witchcraft. Intense debates between Catholics and Protestants, intense outward warfare between the two sides. And usually what happened is older women would become targets. That's why we often have the image in modern media of witches being these kind of old hags. They would, black cats became symbols of the devils, which is familiar, basically the way they would correspond with the devil. But what would happen is, usually these older women were outcasts of society. They'd usually lost everything they had, lost family. Local charities that had usually helped them before, these women in poverty, were no longer functioning for a variety of reasons. And so these women on the outskirts of society would often resort to selling herbs or potions for sicknesses, love potions, and things like that. And so they got accused of being witches for incantations and spells. Or sometimes just a strange old lady in the edge of town that nobody liked, and they would be accused of being a witch. Just people saying nasty things, and the charges escalate until eventually execution. Now remember, the 16th and 17th century, women were considered by most theologians to be inferior to men. That is, women were more susceptible to witchcraft and the influences of the devil than men were, because they were weaker. At least that way they saw it. So women were typically accused of witchcraft far more often. Now, by the 1650s, these began to subside, but there were numerous cases. There's one case in Germany, there were, better part of a year or so, tens of thousands of people accused of witchcraft and executed. What happened was people suddenly started seeing these bizarre visions, strange colors, hearing voices, seeing dogs speak, houses and objects taking misshapen forms, people suffering these horrible hallucinations. No explanation except what they believed was witchcraft. Had to be evil at stake. So people began to be accusing others of witchcraft left and right. As more people saw that suffered these hallucinations, more people were hanged or burned at the stake, hundreds, even thousands. But what ended up happening was, scientists learned years later, was a fungus had infected the rye that was being planted in Germany. Rye is a type of grain which they used to bake bread out of. But this particular fungus was not taken off, was usually baked in with this rye bread. And what had happening was this particular fungus, when ingested, causes hallucinations. In fact, it was one of the active ingredients later incorporated into LSD when the CIA developed it in the 1940s, 1950s. So it was basically an acid trip. Probably most notorious in America was the Salem witch trials in 1693. 3 young girls began feigning convulsions and accusing various people, members of various factions in their small community in Salem, Massachusetts, of being witches, of being in league with the devil. Of course, being a tight-knit Puritan community, the one kind of on the edge of survival, on the edge of the wilderness, frightened, they're terrified, and suddenly dozens of people accused left and right of being witches, being in league with evil. Many people were hung with barely a trial without any evidence at all, just on the accusation, unfounded, that somehow they're committing an act of evil, what they believe they must be destroyed. It was found out, as everything wound down, though, that these girls were making it all up. All these charges were false. There were no witches in Salem. There never were. And all this panic, this destruction, all these people being arrested, accused, being executed, was over nothing. This was the last major witchcraft trial anywhere in the world. People realize that they don't have to be afraid of the dark. They don't have to jump at shadows, that law and order and due process of law matter. Now, with the late 17th century, you have Stuart England. We talked about James I Scotland taking the throne after the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Protestant king had authorized the publication of King James Bible, authorized new colonies in the New World. Among those during his reign would be the Plymouth colony, the Massachusetts Bay colony, and the Virginia colony, particularly Jamestown, founded in 1607. His son Charles I, though, would have extreme problems with uprisings, corruption, misspending money. And as England's economic problems worsened, clashes with Parliament ensued. Parliaments controlled by Puritans began demanding more rights from Parliament, greater say in the affairs of the nation, more rights for the people, but King Charles refused, and eventually it exploded into open warfare. And of the execution of King Charles I, ruled by Parliament, by Oliver Cromwell for a time, in 1660, Charles II becomes king. This is called the Restoration. Actually, he was the oldest son of Charles I. Monarchists in England declared him to be king once Charles I was executed, but Charles was unable to exercise his claim until the Parliament invited Charles back in as king. Probably it could not run itself. It needed a figurehead to maintain order in England. Charles comes in after settling a few old scores against the men who were responsible for the murder of the execution of his father, or the murder if you were a monarchist. Charles II settled down and had a very good working relationship with Parliament. Charles had learned the lessons that his father refused to learn, recognizing that he needed Parliament to govern, that powers of the king in England were limited, and they must respect the rights of Parliament, of the people. He was able to rule very effectively. But Charles didn't have any direct heirs, and so his younger brother, James II, came to power upon his death. Now, James II had never been expected to be king. He was raised in the royal court of France. And so he was raised with French ideas about the monarchy, which was absolutism. That is, the idea of absolute power. The French believed the king was answerable only to God for his actions. Named by God to be king, ruled by God's will, and answered only to God. Power was absolute. This is very different from the English tradition. The idea of limited power of the king, the idea of checks on power, the idea of due process, the idea of rights of the people. Ideas were distinctly English, and by this point, more than 400 years old. James had also been raised by his Spanish mother, who was a Catholic wife of King Charles, to be a Roman Catholic. Now, because of the order of succession, James was going to be king. Parliament was a little nervous about this, a little leery about this, but James seemed to not have any heirs, and so they accepted James as king. James, however, did not remember the lessons his father had not learned. James began ignoring Parliament repeatedly, breaking the law, appointing Catholics to high offices, in which case the Parliament had banned Catholics from holding office, simply Protestants only. What they call a religious test, that is, you had to prove you belonged to a particular faith before you could enter a particular office. Actually, it doesn't matter what you believe. First, you have the modern American notion, which is no religious tests, which is you don't have to prove that you belong to any particular faith or any faith at all to hold a particular office. It's just simply a matter of, can you do the job? Regardless of what you believe, are you willing to do the job? Are you willing to follow the Constitution and the laws of the country? Regardless of where you go to church, if you go at all. England in the 1600s didn't have this. You had to be a professing Protestant. And so James ignored that, started appointing Catholics to high office, and started ignoring even more edicts left and right about Parliament, about the spending, about the taxation, about the authority of the king. Like say, anger and discord between Parliament and the king grew. Finally, the king announced that he and his wife had had a child and was going to be raised as Catholic. So Parliament decided that it was time to get rid of King James II. So the Glorious Revolution in 1689. Parliament declared the monarchy to be vacant, in which case he invited William of Orange and Sister Mary. Orange is a province in the Netherlands. He invited those two to come in and be King and Queen of England. Now, so they didn't just pick somebody out at random. See, William and Mary were Protestants. Mary was the sister of James and Charles. So, they're part of the Stuart dynasty. They just basically kicked James out and invited William and Mary in 1689. And James II, fearing the fate of his father, left England on the first ship out of the country as quickly as he could, never looked back, never came back to England again. So this period came to be called the Glorious Revolution, which England claims that a budding tyrant was deposed without a drop of blood being spilled. As the will of Parliament would be obeyed above all else. Parliament saw themselves increasingly as the voice of the people. And increasingly, more and more people are being able to vote in parliamentary elections, and Parliament is gaining more power to decide law through law for the people of England. So the lower house of Parliament would be elected. Now, only a select few people could vote in these elections. It's the beginning of a process, beginning of an evolution towards a democratic state. What you have today is a constitutional monarchy, which is Parliament controls the lawmaking process, the representative body of people, and the monarchy is simply a figurehead, just simply there to decide over things, make sure everything is done orderly, a reminder of tradition of England and English customs. The Glorious Revolution caused some philosophical fallout over the nature of government and the nature of law and representation. That's more a subject of the second half of this course. Now, in the meantime, you have other figures dominating the scene. Particularly in France, King Louis XIV. Louis XIV was an absolute monarch, believed that idea of absolutism. They also called it the divine right of kings. That is, since you are made king by God and rule the blessings of God, since you are answerable only to God, the king has that divine right to do whatever he says, whatever he wants, answerable only to God. The divine right of kings. Because the idea, since God made him king, therefore anything he does is approved by God. Louis XIV comes in some years after the end of the French Wars of Religion. It's not an easy peace between the Protestants, that is the Huguenots, and the Catholics in France. Or Huguenots, those are French Calvinists. Small portion of the population, but they were a large portion of the nobility. An increasingly large number of peasants as well. But the French Calvinists, though, were at odds with the Catholic king. And Louis XIV comes in. He's only 4 years old when he becomes king. 4 years old. Certainly his father, Louis XIII, was only 5 when he came to the throne. Now Louis XIII, so young, he could only rule through a regent, in this case, Cardinal Richelieu. That is, this French cardinal, high official in the Roman Catholic Church. He'll be helping to guide the young king, teaching him how to be a king and how to effectively rule as a French king. Remember, this cardinal, he's not the kindly, in this case, he's not the kindly grandfatherly minister figure you might think of. This is a hardened, cynical European politician. He believes in the divine right of kings. He believes in absolutism. He likes the fact he's making these decisions for this young child, acting as king. And Richelieu called Louis XIII to be an absolute monarch. Louis XIII, very apt pupil, proved that idea. But he dies at a young age, and his oldest surviving son is Louis XIV, just 4 years old. Probably couldn't even identify his country on a map. But because of the hereditary system of monarchy, it meant that the oldest surviving son becomes king, no matter the age, 4 years old. Obviously can't rule on his own, can't even write yet, so Cardinal Mazarin is appointed as his regent. By Cardinal Richelieu, believed in absolutism, believed in this divine right of kings. Louis XIV, extraordinarily apt. He took these lessons very well. When he becomes king on his own as an adult, he portrays himself as the Sun King. The sun symbols on all royal decrees and on money and all over France. Basically Louis XIV portrayed himself as the source of light and goodness for all his people. That he is the sun that shines down on France. Well, Louis XIV, though, as a devout Catholic, believed in absolutely no questioning or this questioning of his rule. So this becomes a problem again. Whereas Henry of Navarre had solved this problem. He had not in 1598. Louis XIV is going to reverse course because Louis XIV cannot tolerate any idea that there is not absolute conformity in religious and governmental thought. There's going to be no dissent of any type within his administration. Church and state are one and the same. If you don't believe the same church as Louis XIV, how can you believe in the idea of divine right of kings? That is, that the king is answerable only to God for what he does. So in 1685, you have the Edict of Fontainebleau. What this does is strips Huguenots of all their religious rights and property rights. That is, to be a citizen of France, to own property, to have any kind of rights at all, you must be a practicing sworn Roman Catholic. Louis XIV orders that all Huguenot churches and schools be destroyed, not performing, be arrested. As a result, 200,000 Huguenots fled to the Netherlands, to Germany, to England, friendly Protestant countries, many of them eventually coming to the Americas. It's an absolute devastation of Huguenots across France in order to pursue this idea of absolute conformity. France was a powerful state in Europe under Louis XIV. That went there and challenge his rule or challenge his country's power. But it's also under Louis XIV that the idea of high fashion style and art being synonymous with France really emerges. It was Louis XIV that really pushed for this idea of style, grace, and elegance as part of court life, the nobility, the king, and he spent a lot of money trying to portray this image of elegance and the height of modern fashion. Among other things, Louis XIV is famous for the Palace of Versailles, which is about 20 miles outside Paris, the capital. Basically, not just a castle or an old medieval fortress. This would be a palace, a mansion never before seen in Europe. Absolutely the best of everything. Louis would effectively rule France from Versailles and have absolutely everything he needed right there on the grounds of Versailles. Huge building. Water fountains, running water, elegantly maintained gardens, everything coated in gold or silver or fine crystal and mirrors. If I go to the books here on page 457, you see an engraving of Versailles, elegantly expert architecture. 458, on an area of Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors. Place that could hold thousands of guests and often did. And they have court favorites living there, hundreds of people, all paying homage to Louis XIV. Masterpieces of art on the ceiling, walls, everywhere. Versailles was such a masterpiece of architecture that you had kings all over Europe scrambling to try to make a copy of Versailles, trying to match the achievement Louis achieved with Versailles. But for all these efforts, for all these dozens of palaces modeled after Versailles, they were all pale imitations of this. Spain found itself in decline. The immense wealth it had gained from the New World, billions of dollars in gold and silver, was lost through war, mismanagement. Or had billions of dollars in gold and silver, then getting into the 1500s, about 1596 it was bankrupt. They'd spent all of it. They're like drunken sailors. And such men as Philip III, King 1598 to 1621. His father had been Philip II, the one courted Elizabeth I to no avail and married Queen Mary. Well, Philip had spent lavishly on palaces, so much so that Spain was left in bankruptcy by 1607. His finance minister, the Duke of Lerma, staffed efficient offices with relatives, and all of them had embezzled, swindled off the top, leaving Spain penniless. His successor was Philip IV, king from 1621 to 1665. Now, Spain would still be a significant power in Europe and the Americas, but the 17th century wore on, power lessened considerably. By the 18th century, Spain would be a power broker in France, but really more of an afterthought compared to the powers of England and France. Well, Philip, with his chief minister, Gaspar de Guzman, worked to revive the monarchy. Reforms curtailed the power of the church and landed aristocracy and attempted to centralize power on the throne. But the aristocrats, though, were a fifth of the population, moved to thwart many of these efforts. They had power and wealth and prestige in Spain. They weren't going to have Philip IV take it away from them. But during this 30 Years' War, which took place during most of Philip's reign in Germany, still a Habsburg area ruled by the Habsburg royal family, which of course Philip IV is a Habsburg. The war depleted the Spanish treasury. Spain defended to the bitter end the Catholic position in Germany, that is the Holy Roman Empire. It was greatly depleted the Spanish treasury. Spain was unable to produce victory or suppress internal revolts and just steadily dwindled away. In Brandenburg, Prussia, the 1600 is simply a series of disconnected masses in western, central, and eastern Germany to the Baltic coast. The Holy Roman Empire was hundreds of independent municipalities, bishoprics, principalities, and baronies. It slowly starts coming together, mostly under the power of one of the larger, more powerful ones, the Kingdom of Brandenburg and Prussia. Yeah, Frederick William, the Great Elector, he was a king from 1640 to 1688. He built an effective army and protected his many disparate holdings across Germany. 1678, he had an army of 40,000 men, a huge army for the time period, that absorbed 50% of his nation's revenues. But his officers and bureaucrats, the Junkers, they dominated, the aristocrats, the Junkers, dominated the officer corps and dominated the bureaucracy of Brandenburg and Prussia. It continued to be a problem for Prussia for many years. Frederick III, 1688 to 1713, supported the continuation of the Holy Roman Empire and took the title of King of Prussia in 1701. Essentially, it would be a kingdom within a kingdom. Using the stability of the Holy Roman Empire, a system of many different states to maintain his own position and expand it where possible. Brandenburg and Prussia would be the dominant force throughout the Holy Roman Empire and the Germanification of coming decades, and in fact, it would be Prussia that would found the modern nation of Germany. Now, the great rival, Austria, King Leopold I tried to expand the Austrian Empire eastward, but Turkish power revived by the late 1600s. Turks again laid siege to Vienna in 1683. Austrian Empire, their allies counterattacked and destroyed Turkish forces in Austria, and then taking Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, and Slovenia by 1687 under Leopold I. 1713, because they're related to the they're part of the Habsburg dynasty themselves, they had better control the Spanish Netherlands, transferring control from Spain to Austria. Then we get to the story of Russia. Now, remember earlier in our history, we talked about how Viking explorers in Norway and Denmark had moved westward, laying siege to the coasts of Europe, and even establishing a stronghold in northern France. Viking raiders would be laying siege to large portions of England. But one reason why England became a Germanic language is because of the influence of the Danes and the Norwegians as the Vikings moving into the region. In fact, for a long period in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, you could go from Denmark to England and speak the same language. It's very similar in their structure, even today. But whereas the Norwegian Vikings went went west, the Swedish Vikings went east, particularly into Russia. And Russia and Sweden would have a long simmering rivalry against each other lasting for centuries. Eventually, as you can see here on page 467, eventually settled in around the city of Moscow, which became a great principality in its own right, steadily expanding its influence in the region. But the problem that the Russians will face is, initially, they're a very weak power, and they're facing opposition from even further east, that is the Mongols. 13th century, the Mongols had laid waste across all of Asia and pushing in on Europe. The Mongols, by Genghis Khan and his successors, had taken control of China, Korea, Southeast Asia, India, even pushed it all the way into the Middle East, taking Arabia and the Holy Lands. And also across Russia and even pushing into Poland. This is by 1215. 1215 seemed like they were unstoppable. Suddenly the great Khan, Genghis Khan, died, and all the Mongol warriors went back to their capital and decided who would be a new leader and trying to spread out again. But they would never again have quite the same territorial extent. But in the ensuing centuries, though, the Mongols were not so much interested in cultural domination as they were in military and financial domination. Basically, Mongol armies would go out and basically collect tribute for the great Khans. One dominating Russia was called the Golden Horde. Basically, they just went out and took as much money as they could find. Mongol would be a problem in the areas well into the Middle Ages. But slowly, though, the Mongol Empire weakened. As they did, Russia began expanding, taking on the Mongols. With Russia, you have that interesting combination of Asian architecture and European architecture. It's basically crossroads, the border, middle ground between Asia and Europe, looking both directions. And as it grew in strength, Russia increasingly wanted to become part of the mainstream of Europe, but internal problems within Russia often make that problematic. But part of Moscow, though, was kings in Ukraine. The Kievan Rus, that is the Russian princes who would rule from Kiev in Ukraine, they could ultimately control Moscow, not control Moscow. They would, Ukraine and what would become Russia were often at odds with each other. But in the early Middle Ages, remember, you still have the Byzantine Empire. Ukraine was part of these trade routes and so forth. And eventually what ended up happening is you have several Byzantine princesses marrying some of these Russian nobles. And so what ends up happening is Russia ends up taking an Orthodox Christian outlook. There's one coming from the Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople. So they're closer to Constantinople than they are to Rome, so they're getting more influence from this area than they would from Rome or from Central or Western Europe. Well, you have a series of massive civil wars, deaths from assassination, coups, and so forth. And eventually you get to Ivan IV. Rules Russia from 1533 to 1584. It's called the Terrible because the man is a psychopath, murderer. Killed people with his own hands, butchered people left and right. Of all the people he ordered executed, he ordered their names could never be spoken, believing that if the names were unspoken, they could not go to the afterlife. Well, Ivan is the first to take the title of Tsar. It's Cyrillic. It's hard to put a letter for letter translation. It's often spelled T-S-A-R, C-Z-A-R. But basically, it's Russian for Caesar. It is part of that old Byzantine influence from Constantinople, taking that title. So Ivan is basically assuming the power of being the emperor. Now, Ivan can't go west because Sweden is too powerful and Poland is too powerful. In fact, Poland is the dominant force in Eastern Europe into the Middle Ages on up to about the early 1700s. But lands to the east were prime for taking. No one really wanted them, except for the Mongols. They're weakening power. Russia's gaining strength, so Ivan starts pushing steadily eastward, relentlessly eastward. Ukraine is taken under, ultimately back and forth under his rule, but basically he's pushing east towards the Ural Mountains. By the time he dies, 1584, it's here, page 467. You see, you have an independent Ukraine, but an independent Poland and Lithuania combined to one kingdom to the west. Basically, the whole area from just not quite to the Baltic Sea to the Ural Mountains, it's all Russia. Already the largest nation in Europe by landmass, but lightly populated. Not a lot of people want it. Its successors are going to end up seizing Siberia and those other regions, pushing all the way to the Pacific, all the expense of the Mongols. But Ivan during his reign, he's frustrated by the boyars, who are the Russian nobles. They control the finances, the manpower, the land, constantly thwarting his goals, centralize his powers, expand the kingdom. So frustrated at one point, he abdicates. Simply says, okay, have your way, I'm leaving. Walks away from Russia. What happens is, just as he calculated, chaos ensues. The boyars can't maintain control of Russia. One faction ever tries to maintain power, they can't do it. There's such a horrible chaos that the boyars eventually decide they have to invite Ivan back into power. Ivan does so, conditioned that his power be full and absolute. Comes back in, executes his enemies, the real and or suspected, thousands killed. He built St. Basil's Cathedral, probably the most famous symbol in Russia, getting the finest and the best architects and builders he could find from Europe and Russia and Asia. Created a beautiful, ornate building. Combination of Asian architecture, Orthodox Christianity, and European sensibilities. Very striking symbol. Beautiful building. But I considered it so beautiful that when it was completed, he ordered the builders all to be blinded. So he could never again build something so beautiful again, never again rival what he had built, the cathedral. Now, at one point, in an argument with his son in the royal palace, kills his son's bare hands. Basically takes his royal scepter and hits him in the head with it. He drops dead on the spot. And basically, kind of like a fever being broken, and it kind of breaks him. Stops his executions. He allows the names of the dead to be read, and just is very quiet, reflective remainder of his life until he dies in 1584. But Russia, there is still some confusion for some time. There's a very deeply stratified society, dominated by the nobles, that is, the boyars, and the Russian Orthodox Church. Start from the still practiced and very deeply protected. In fact, Russia would be the last nation on earth to abolish serfdom, doing so in 1861. I'll finally get to the figure of Peter the Great. It's Peter the First, the Great. Wrote from 1689 to 1725. In fact, some of these figures, some of these Western civilization classes, the cutoff date is sometimes 1689, the date of the Glorious Revolution. Sometimes it's the 1750, the end of the reign of Louis XIV, dying at the age of 76, because he had so dominated the era in Europe and France. Sometimes it's 1725, after Peter the First. You have these dominant, powerful figures that would transform their nations. Louis XIV, Peter the Great, Frederick III, Elizabeth I, and so many others. Peter the Great, to this day in Russia, is a great hero, is a builder and reformer, strong man, towering into 6 feet 9 inches tall, a giant for the time. Very intelligent, enjoyed very crude humor, kind of a college frat boy type. Well, he had his older brother, who was mentally disabled, ruled with him initially for some years until he died. But when his brother died, he was able to rule on his own. 1697, 1698, he toured Western Europe, and seeing all the innovations in Europe and how Russia was kind of the backwater wastelands of Europe and left behind in so many ways, Peter decides to westernize Russia. He's going to make it as much like Europe as possible, transforming society by whatever means necessary. On England, he learns all about the navies and ships. And so when he returns, he reorganizes the Russian army, basing it more on a Central and Western European style, and builds the first navy by hand. Learned everything he could about building ships from the English, and teaches Russian carpenters how to build ships, because Russia at this point is still landlocked. And so they have some outlets on the on the Arctic Ocean, but nothing they could use effectively as a battle force, especially in the 17th century. So he teaches his carpenters how to build a navy. And he test pilots the first Russian Navy ship himself, piloting it down the river, insisting the crew not to call him Emperor or Tsar, but call him Captain. Peter the Great once said to have remarked that if he could be anything other than the Emperor of Russia, he'd rather be an admiral in the English Navy. It was Peter that started the first Russian newspaper. He was the first dentist bringing modern dental techniques from Europe to Russia. He abandoned the title of Tsar and chose instead the title of Emperor. Something several future leaders of Russia will be following. He reorganized the government in 1711, creating a Senate to supervise the administrative machinery of the state while he was out campaigning militarily. There was campaigns he'd seize eastern Ukraine and Kiev, bringing it back under Russian control. The Senate, however, proved to be ineffective. He had divided Russia into 8 provinces in 1719 into 50 different provinces, tried to better administer the state, but it's kind of difficult to do. So many of the boyars having their own agendas separate from the emperors. The military absorbed 4/5 of the state revenue. 80% of their tax dollars went to the army and to the navy. The reform of the church, reformed Russian culture. It is particularly one thing he did was long beards that were common with the Russians and the boyars. They were out of style in the West, so he ordered them to be cut. In fact, he had barbers standing at city limits on it, but anytime anybody came into the city or the royal palace, they just yanked their beard and cut it short. Women are allowed to participate in the Russian royal court, that is, they are permitted there in the presence of the emperor for the first time ever. It was a custom in Europe for many centuries, just now being practiced in Russia. And women are also allowed to marry freely for the first time. They didn't have to get permission from their fathers or be no more arranged marriages. They could enter into marriage freely if they wished. We also have with Russia the Great Northern War. Question: who would control the Baltic, the Swedes or the Russians? Lasted for 20 years, 1701 to 1721. Peter's great rivals became Charles XII of Sweden. After many years of fighting, eventually Peter forces his way to a foothold on the Baltic Sea and builds a new capital, St. Petersburg. Russia would still be a capital, basically a capital for most of the year, but St. Petersburg mostly a wintertime capital, but a heavy military presence. The largest city in Russia, one of the largest cities in Russia, Peter basically built it himself. Laid out the designs, oversaw the construction and designs of buildings and streets. Still the great Russian port of the Baltic Sea. And to this day, St. Petersburg is still one of the most important cities in Russia. Peter is such an important figure in Russia that to today all leaders of Russia try to emulate Peter I to some degree. Try some transformative approach, some great measures, some great ambitious measure for Russia. It's a legendary figure. And Peter lived his life, died as much as he lived, hands-on, determined to the end. 1725, he's walking along the coast of this proud new city, admiring the ships in the bay and buildings along the coast. It's all one ship foundering out of the sea. The ship is sinking, men are falling into the icy sea. Well, without giving it a second thought, Peter jumps into the sea, swims out to the men, starts pulling as many to shore as possible, saving many lives. But what ended up happening, though, being a wintry Russian day, it was very cold in that water, very cold in that air. It was a bad cold which turns into pneumonia. And in 1725, Peter the Great dies. Hands-on to the very end. That's scientific revolution. This is into the late 1600s. You have a revival in the interest of learning and science. There had been kind of a lull period beforehand, the century beforehand. And you have increasingly important discoveries being made in science and scientific principles and mathematical principles which transform the world, which lay the foundation for modern science and modern technology. The ancient study that old Greco-Roman philosophers such as Plato, Archimedes, and Ptolemy had made many medieval thinkers realize that Aristotle and Galen, kind of the physician, were contradicted, could be questioned. particularly a lot of the astronomical ideas of Aristotle. There would be a lot of technical problems with it. Navigation, calculating tonnage ships, so forth. Technical problems like that were causing problems in shipping. So they began searching for new answers. People who had the answers, the Greeks and the Romans, particularly as the thinker Petrarch in the 14th century. Petrarch had searched the monastic libraries, searched ancient Greek and Latin texts, discovered them, began transmitting them across Europe. Now, men such as Aristotle and particularly Claudius Ptolemy, 2nd century AD, about 500 years after Aristotle, they believed the universe was perfect. The earth was the center. That is the idea of the geocentric world. Geocentric. That is the sun, the moon, all the planets orbit around the earth. And this fit an idea perfectly with the medieval Christian theology. That is the idea that earth is the center of God's attention and God's creation. In fact, maps of the world at this time put Jerusalem as the center of the world. All the maps be focused on Jerusalem, everything radiated from out that point. Jerusalem, basically the Holy Land, the Holy City, center of God's attention, the center of the universe. But increasing observations by astronomers in the Middle Ages began making it apparent that the universe did not operate in this manner. It's the idea of everything circling the Earth. There are too many mathematical problems, too many observational problems. So there's serious problems starting to emerge with this. Here at page 490, 491 of the book. On the left you see the Ptolemaic geocentric idea of the world. Earth at the middle, ordered by the moon, then Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Everything beyond there, the universe beyond. But there are too many observational problems. So along comes Nicholas Copernicus. He's a Polish mathematician, Polish cleric. And in the early 1500s, he's looking at these observations, making calculations, and makes a sudden realization that the geocentric idea is wrong. So he publishes his alternative, heliocentrism. Sun-centered universe. It is, well, the moon orbited the Earth, Earth and all the planets orbited the Sun. Heliocentrism. It turned out to be correct, but it was completely at odds with the Catholic Church's ideas of the universe. Copernicus realized this and had his ideas published only on his deathbed on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, 1543. So disturbed by what he said and what it might mean for the Catholic Church, he simply did not want it published, because particularly this is the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church had enough problems, didn't need astronomy on top of it, particularly astronomy that seemed to line up with the Catholic Church's ideas of the world. But Copernicus' idea corrected the growing observational conflicts, but his ideas create a little stir first, so he's not publicizing it much. Along comes Galileo. From 1564 to 1642, an Italian astronomer, man of brilliance, made the first observations of the night sky with a telescope. Things like telescopes before. He's the first one really to apply it to astronomy. In fact, with that, it changed the practice of astronomy forever. You can't think of astronomy without using telescopes, one of the most basic instruments of inquiry. Discover such amazing things never before noticed, such as lunar mountains, as mountains on the moon. You thought the moon was completely smooth. There are 4 moons orbiting Jupiter out of dozens known today. They saw them all orbiting Jupiter. Jupiter wasn't the only thing with moons. The phases of Venus as it orbited the Sun. And rings around Saturn. Most astronomers believe the rings would be solid until the 1890s. It was made up of millions of tiny particles of ice and dust. Galileo concluded that the planets are not composed of material substance similar to Earth, not some perfect, unchanging, ethereal substance. He also concluded the Earth and the planets orbited the Sun. But as he's agreeing with heliocentrism. But the conclusion shocked Catholic officials who believed the heavens are made of spiritual substance and Earth was not the center of God's creation. I guess at the point that he's placed on trial for his beliefs. See, the heliocentric world here on page 491, you see the Sun at the middle. Mercury is the first planet, and Venus, Earth, the Moon orbiting, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Stellarum, Fixarum, and Mobilis. It is the fixed mobile stars in the firmament of heaven. Galileo insisted this is the way the world works. The only way the observations worked is if Earth was in orbit around the Sun. But Catholic Church objected for many reasons, believing that their idea of heaven and earth, the universe, meant that Earth was immobile, the center of God's creation. But they pointed to one particular Bible verse to prove it, Psalm 93:1. Where that is, that the earth shall not be moved. Now the reference there, though, is the earth in a spiritual sense, not in a physical sense. One of the questions of the Bible being wrong was one person's or one group of people's interpretation of it. With these ideas so fixed into the minds of Catholic hierarchy that couldn't possibly comprehend anything else. This idea of proof texting, that is, that came to the Bible with a particular agenda, read one verse, seemed to support it, could think of nothing else. And there were others who were saying that they're finding problems with the Copernicus and Galileo's observations and calculations, that the orbits weren't quite perfect, they weren't quite lining up right, so therefore the whole idea of heliocentrism must be wrong. See, certain important scientific principles you have to understand, which are really emerging in this time period. One thing, the difference between theory and law. Theory is a conclusion based on observations of a phenomenon. There's a proposed explanation. I'm sure we'll be clear about that. Proposed explanation of it based on observations of phenomena in nature. Versus law, which is scientific definition of a process. See, in theory, it can never become a law. The two are completely separate concepts in nature. They're apples and oranges. A law describes how something works. It answers the question, what? Theory basically answers the question, how and why. Proposed explanation based on observations in nature. If it is with a theory, it's something that's already been seen. It's not a guess. It's something that's already been seen. They're trying to get these observations, and with those observations they have, they're trying to explain why it's happening like that. A law defining how it works. So theory and law can never become the same. But also one thing about science is it's not an either-or proposition. Because you disprove one thing in science does not mean you've proven another. Everything must be proven or disproven based on its own merits. one at a time. Not an either-or proposition. You have to prove one or disprove it, and go to the next thing, prove it or disprove it. You do that by repeated experimentation and also by continual observation and continual research. But above all, you must have the humility to realize when you might be wrong. Now, what do ideas like this relate to in our time? Evolution. Perhaps the most famous idea. Evolution has been observed in nature. Changing of traits within a species over many successive generations. That has been observed many times. So why certain medications suddenly become, such antibiotics suddenly become useless to certain strains of bacteria? Why? Evolution. Why do creatures change form over time? Evolution. Why can you create certain characteristics of animals by certain selective breeding? Evolution. How does that happen? Definition of process, law of genetics. By Gregor Mendel in the 19th century. But again, you'll have some people pointing to problems within it, trying to say, well, therefore there's this problem, therefore it doesn't work. Therefore it has to be this other way. It doesn't work like that. You may have certain disputes in science over what direction an evolutionary line may be taking, but the overall principle of evolution doesn't change. Whatever biblical statements on evolution may be in effect, people may point to, that are being misinterpreted. Get out here, proof texting. But Galileo, well, he creates a revolution with his discoveries and his ideas on the heliocentric universe. He publicizes them widely. The church is very critical of him, eventually placing him on trial for heresy, forcing him to repent or face execution. At that threat, Galileo recants. The mutter of the breath after he recants saying, it still moves. So Galileo dies in 1642. And understand what's also happening at the same time here. This is taking place during the 30 Years' War. Vicious fight between Catholics and Protestants. The Catholic Church still seeing itself under threat. 1620, the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. All this is happening at the same time. Remember, history does not happen in a vacuum. There's a reason why things happen when they do. The world's changing, many people can't accept it. They're seeing new things about the world. Some people won't see new things about the world, want to change, want to push those changes. But the Catholic Church, though, stuck to its guns for a long time. They would not recant on Galileo for another 350 years, not until 1989. And this is after decades of further observations about the universe, deep space probes sent to the edges of the solar system, saying that yes, indeed, the Earth does orbit the Sun, the planets do orbit the Sun. Galileo and Copernicus were right. But as for the observational problems, well, you have the Earth, the Sun, planets orbiting the Sun. You have the Earth here, Sun orbiting it, Moon orbiting it. You don't see problems like, say, Mars. Because sometimes when Mars, as people observing Mars, it's moving along very nicely, pace across the sky, and seems to slow down, stop, back up, stop, and then go forward. Now, of course, to believers of the geocentric theory, that proved that retrograde motion proved that the heliocentric theory didn't work. So they proposed something called epicycles to fix that. Because basically, planets orbited orbits on top of orbits, epicycles. That is, that's why they seem to see it, because they're on these epicycles. Of course, there's no evidence for this. It's a proposed explanation. seem to match up, but there are even problems, though, with the epicycle theory. So why does that seem to happen? Well, supporters of the heliocentric theory say that's because as the Earth orbits the Sun faster than Mars is orbiting on a larger orbit, it's simply a matter of optical illusion. You're orbiting from Earth, you see Mars here, up here in the sky. But Mars is going slower, so it seems like it's slowing down. As the Earth reaches this arc on its orbit, it seems like all of a sudden it's backing up. Then all of a sudden it seems like it's moving forward again because the Earth's moving faster on a smaller orbit, while Mars is moving slower on a larger orbit. Optical illusion. But there was one man who fixed all these observational problems. That man's name is Johannes Kepler. Mathematician and philosopher, lived in 1571-1630. Developed the laws of planetary motion. Differing slightly from Copernicus by stating the planetary orbits are not perfectly circular, but elliptical orbits. Not perfect circles, but slightly flattened orbits. Conditioned to held this day by observation of astronomers. In fact, laws of planetary motion so accurate that they use that to use them to calculate the orbits and the trajectories of the deep space probes. The recent probe to Pluto, the New Horizons spacecraft, calculated that with the laws of planetary motion and so forth. Isaac Newton. Whereas we see Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking as symbols of genius in our time, Isaac Newton was the symbol for the 17th, 18th century. Now, his influence extended more into the Enlightenment period. Newton, more than any other figure of his time, revolutionized the way the West saw the universe. His most important work was the Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which was written in Latin, called Principium. Developed the universal laws of gravitation and motion still used by scientists to this day. Basically had three laws of motion. Inertia, which is an object at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted upon by some force. It is this marker in my hand is going to stay at rest unless acted upon by some other force. It could be my fingers moving, it could be some gust of wind, or something else, but or somebody knocks it out of my hand, but it will stay in place unless acted upon by some other force. Second, acceleration. Body in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by some other force. That is, I drop this marker, it will stay in motion, same rate and direction unless acted upon by some other force. It is, and third, momentum. Body motion will stay in motion at the same rate and direction as acted upon by another force. Acceleration, the rate of change in motion proportional to the force acting on it. But the momentum, body, motion stay in motion, same rate and direction as acted upon by another force. It is falls to the ground. It will continue falling as acted upon by some other force. It is, in this case, the force of the floor acting against it. It's unable to move past the floor. Gravity is acting on this marker. That's the force acting upon it. But it will stay in motion towards the center of mass, towards the center of gravity, unless acted upon by some other force. Paper knocks it away, altering its trajectory, altering its acceleration. Rate of acceleration to gravity, that's a constant. Unless acted upon by some other force. Some sudden gust of wind or somebody knocking it aside, the rate of acceleration will stay the same. In fact, this is used all the time in engineering. In fact, you use it when you drive to work or school in the morning. Calculating how fast do you need to accelerate to get to a certain speed. How much distance do you need to apply the brakes and safely reach the stop sign, and so forth. Used for jet aircraft, spacecraft, cars, everything. even principles used in architecture. Newton developed the theory of the law of gravitation, which forever changes the structure of astronomy. That basically we live in a Newtonian universe. Also the idea that with Newtonian physics, it is called, so the laws of gravity, the theory of gravity as well, which is, why do objects fall to the ground? That is gravity. It is Newton theorized that there is a force that brings objects to the center of mass, gravity. That's how we understand it. Now, for all these complicated ideas of motion, gravitation, so forth, it took a lot of new calculations and complicated calculations to understand. So, it developed a new mathematics called calculus, and also a German mathematician, Wilhelm Leibniz. But Leibniz kind of made calculus a little bit more easier to understand. But calculus basically is a way of doing large-scale sums and calculations very quickly. So, for example, what is the length of this circle, or what is the length of this line, or how do you calculate the area of this box here, irregular box? Again, all done through calculus, the fundamental precepts of engineering used today. Also, you have another scientist mathematician coming along. It is René Descartes, mathematician and philosopher from France. He built a system of graphing coordinates used by mathematicians today. It is the Cartesian graph, XY coordinates on a graph, like this, or like this. That is a Cartesian graph built by this man. He also created a firestorm among philosophers with his book Discourse on Method in 1637. His work, he stated that an individual can never be absolutely certain about anything in the world around him except his own existence. In this work, he introduced the phrase cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That you can never be certain of anything in the world except the fact that you exist. Everything else could be an illusion. You can never be entirely sure. Philosophers are trying to argue this and back and forth ever since then. That was René Descartes. Important advances in medicine as well. Andreas Vesalius. Vesalius was a Belgian physician living in the 16th century, undertook new studies of human anatomy, led to new understandings of medicine and the workings of the human body. 1543 book on the fabric of the human body dispelled a lot of ancient ideas about how the human body worked. Basically, he's the father of modern physiology. But there'd be another scientist, William Harvey, greatly improved on that. But it's difficult to gather much information on human physiology and medicine at this time period because a lot of it required work and the study of cadavers, that is, human bodies, human remains. No one's willing to donate their body to science. They want a good burial. So a lot of scientists and physicians actually go to the point of grave robbing to get cadavers to study, which was highly illegal in the 15th and 16th century. But Vesalius does a lot of important works, dispelling a lot of ideas how the human body worked. But William Harvey shows how it does work, particularly with the heart. The Motion of the Heart was his book in 1657. Harvey was an English physician. He developed a modern theory for the circulation of blood in the body. Basically, he's the one who helps us understand how the heart works and how blood flows in the body, basically through the pumping motion of the heart. Basically, increasing modern understanding of human physiology. The case of Vesalius does takes it light years ahead. In fact, we have our modern ideas about medicine today. An interesting character here, Blaise Pascal. French scientist, mathematician, philosopher, does a little of everything in his short life. From 1623 to 1662. French mathematician and physicist who developed new theories regarding probability and conic sections. He developed a mechanical calculating machine, basically primitive mechanical calculator. Made him so famous that in the mid-20th century, when computers were really starting to get going, they named a computing language after Pascal. Not used much anymore, but it was made very important computer language in the 1960s, 1970s, Pascal. Developed new laws regarding air pressure. Basically, Pascal is a unit of air pressure. But also a philosopher. He saw the growing divide between the church and science over some of these issues, over medicine, over astronomy. Basically, the two are kind of heading toward a divorce. Albert Einstein, decades ago, once said, "Science without religion without science is blind, but science without religion is lame." The two needed each other to kind of explain each other and to keep each other guided and focused. Catholic Church for centuries has been the major patron of learning and science in Europe. But when suddenly the ideas running contrary to their ideas, Catholic Church dismissed it, but the scientists were not about to give it up. It was pursuit of the truth at stake, pursuit of fact. Scientists wanted to know how the universe worked, no matter what direction that took them. If that meant they were Catholic Church would refuse to go along, so be it. They would leave them behind. Increasingly, a lot of scientists saw the church as full of superstition and fear and ignorance. And increasingly, the church saw scientists as heretics and non-believers. But still, you have this work of scientists who are pushing the frontiers of human knowledge and human technology. The basics of what we know about science today came from some of these men. Technology that emerged from some of these scientific ideas emerged with these men. The modern world we have is thanks to these thinkers who want to think outside the box and push these ideas further. But Pascal believed that faith and science do not have to necessarily be contrary to one another. The two can go hand in hand. Formulated Pascal's wager to try to reconcile science and faith. Basically said there are two possibilities, that God exists or God doesn't exist. And for man, there are two possibilities from there. That is, you believe, or you don't believe. Well, according to Pascal, if you believe in God exists, you gain everything. You gain, that's how we say it means infinity. You gain infinity. You gain eternity. Because you believe in God exists. Let's suppose you believe in God doesn't exist. You don't gain or lose anything. You come from nothing, you go back to nothing. You lose or gain nothing. I suppose God exists and you don't believe. Pascal says, well, you lose everything. You lose infinity. But I suppose you don't believe and God doesn't exist. You don't gain anything or lose anything. So according to Pascal's wager, the idea is, if God exists and you believe, the best you can do is gain everything. The very worst you can do is break even. But for Pascal, if you don't believe, the very best you can hope to do is break even. Like I said, it's been an interesting philosophical argument for many centuries, but for those either want to pursue of the truth, no matter what, even if they don't believe, and wanting to wager on that. One of those wanting to take up Pascal's wager, that is the idea that the very worst you can do as a believer is break into. But we end the course where it begins. Man seeking knowledge, using his imagination to solve problems, to answer questions, to move forward. It's thinking and imagination and knowledge and wisdom that are building human society and human civilization. Where it will take kind of the next few centuries, it'll be a long and winding road. It will take us from here in the 21st century, who's to say? But if we study history carefully, listen carefully to the wisdom of great thinkers, avoid the mistakes of the past, and always be willing to look forward with courage, curiosity, and use those skills we have, there is no limit to what humanity can accomplish. More importantly, there's no limit to what you as an individual can accomplish and build for humanity. That is our course.